Okay, let's talk early Russia. Now, this should be a review of the notes you've taken already from reading Stearns, but I added another note sheet to Blackboard if you'd like to use that as you follow along and review. I'll leave it to you to decide. So always we start with geography, and so we'll look at a map in a second of the topography. So notice the grasslands here, dense forests and swamps in the north. These three great rivers sort of define Russian geography, but also helps influence the history. And we'll show you the Black to the Baltic Seas. So these rivers, right, are important because that's how the early Russians will be able to transfer their goods and trade, on the rivers. But part of the year they're frozen. And so a lot of Russian history is driven by not only this, they're expanding their empire by conquest, mostly because they're looking for warm water ports. That is true for ancient, early modern history to modern history. Okay, so here's our topography, right? So you get this idea of the swamps and the grasslands and all that good stuff. Oh, and the Baltic and the Black Sea. Again, so land available for farming. You can see that right through here. If you want to take a minute, ponder the key. Okay, so before 800 CE, right, the forests and the grasslands were inhabited by farmers and traders, no political unity. So this is also the time that we've been talking about, right? Our Viking friends are out and about, and so they are coming around through here, right? We've talked about them hassling our friends in the Byzantine Empire. So because of this, right, these early Russians start to build forts along the rivers, and eventually the Vikings will sort of blend in as well. So here's our rivers: Volga, the Don, and the Dnieper. Okay, so again, like a lot of things, it's a little mysterious how early Russia began, but the legend is that the Vikings are the ones that established early Russia, and that's where we get Russia from the Rus, Rurik the Rus, I think because he had red hair. So, even though that's wrong, it makes for a good legend, and that's all we're dealing with right now, right? Speaking of legends, here's his actual portrait. So he establishes the city of Novgorod. How's that? And it's one of Russia's first important cities. However, by 1880, a nobleman from Novgorod moves down to Kiev on the Dnieper River. And this location obviously puts it a little closer to our friends in Constantinople. And trading with that city will make them quite wealthy, and that will be the beginnings of the power of Kiev, which is in Ukraine today. So here's a city of modern Kiev. Okay, so another important moment for the history of early Russia is in 957 CE, Princess Olga visits Constantinople and converts to Christianity. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, he researched a lot of religions, and out of all of them, he was wary of the Catholic Church in the West because of the Pope, his political power, and so he chose Byzantine Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and here is a painting, notice the date here, 1895, of his baptism. And so soon he makes all of the residents of Kiev baptized in the Dnieper River, which was probably nice and cold. So here's a handy map, so just to set the stage, right, what we've been talking about, right, Hungarians, and here's our early Russia. Okay, so the early Byzantine influences on Russia are important in terms of course, their alphabet. So our Christian missionaries, Saint Cyril and Methodius, help the early Russians create the Cyrillic alphabet, right? They made up, or Cyril, right, helped put letters to the sounds to help them convert to Christianity, and the Russian alphabet then is born. And so we see also their influence in the churches of Russia, the Orthodox Christianity, and here's some Orthodox priests. And I thought I would toss in St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. These are the onion domes, right? So you have the connection to the Byzantine, and then you start to see a distinct Russian flavor here. Okay, so Kiev then becomes the next power player here. And Yaroslav, Vladimir's son, comes to power. He increases trade with Europe, right? And of course, like all good leaders, makes a good legal code, strengthens power and alliances with surrounding nations, and again, strengthens the ties of Constantinople that will continue to establish the power and the wealth of Kiev. So, just as you were getting attached to Kiev, we're going to start to see how it weakens after Yaroslav dies. And he makes a decision which happens many times, but we know from history that doesn't always work. He divides the empire amongst his sons, which starts to weaken Kiev. Then the Crusades, which we'll talk about a little bit later, further weakens the empire. So, in our next kind of major player here is Alexander Nevsky, and so you can see we've jumped ahead a little bit to 1220 to 1263 CE, and so he starts to stop the invading crusaders, especially the Swedes and the Germanic Knights. And by this point, we're going to start talking about our friends, the Mongols. And the Mongols have pushed all the way by the 13th century, right? They've pushed into Russia. And so he convinces the Russian princes to take Mongol rule. And we'll learn the Mongols will leave you alone as long as you pay tribute to them and accept that they're the real bosses. So Nevsky says, look, we can't defeat them, so let's just, we can keep our authority if we submit to their rule. And so this is from 1875, so there's not a lot of original paintings here, but this is the burial of Alexander Nevsky. Okay, so the Mongol invasions and the control of Russia is extremely important in the development of Russian history. So by 1240, the Mongols attack Kiev, and led by Batu Khan, which is Genghis Khan's grandson, they will rule the Russians for 200 years. And this is called the Khanate of the Golden Horde. So here's Kiev, our next major city, Moscow. There you can see Novgorod. And so obviously we'll come and talk about these later, but you can see the other Khanates, right, as the Mongols establish wide control here. So here's a good primary source. This is the sacking of Suzdal, which I think is somewhere up around here. Yeah, by Batu Khan in 1238. So again, medieval paintings, not great on perspective. Okay, so the Mongols, oh, here's a cool one I found. This is him establishing the Golden Horde in 1113 CE. This is a little suspicious, but it's the closest one I could find. And here's a good battle, and I know what you're thinking, but Miss Banker, aren't those Hungarians? Okay, it's true. But I thought this was cool here, the Battle of Mohi with Mongols. So again, they allow for religious freedom as long as the Mongols were paid taxes, usually large amount of money. They also increase the trade because now they're part of this Mongol empire, so they kind of are access to more trade routes. The increase, we saw in the early Byzantine church of the women sort of living in separate quarters, that will continue even more under the Mongols, because the Mongols by this point in history have converted to Islam. And so the Russians then see the absolute power of the Khans, and they will then imitate that later on. Now, for later Russian history, this will be important. It sort of isolates Russia, not only from the Byzantines, but certainly from their Western neighbors. And so we start to see then more of a cultural divide between the West and the Russians, but we'll talk about that more in modern history next year. So now we start to see, so we've kind of transferred from Novgorod to Kiev, and now to Moscow will be the next great city, and as you know, will dominate Russian history for a good chunk of time. So by the 1320s, Prince Ivan the First, known as Ivan the Moneybag, because he sort of makes this deal with the Mongols to collect the tributes. And so he'll collect the tributes from different Russian princes to give to the Mongols, and of course, skims off the top. And he also convinces the Patriarch of Kiev, right, the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia, to move to Moscow. And then with the religious center moving to Moscow, makes Moscow, at that point now, the most important city in Russia. So Ivan the Great, and this is when he rules, so we're kind of dipping into more modern history. And this is a painting from the 1800s of Ivan tearing up the Great Khan's letter requesting more tribute. And you can see he looks much like our earlier Ivan. So he's famous because he starts to establish then what will dominate Russian history, even when it's the Soviet Union, right? They'll still have a strong leader in charge. So he defeats the Mongols. He removes the boyars, and these are the nobility, if you will, from power. So he starts to kind of get rid of any competition and makes himself Tsar or Caesar, right? And this is when he says, you know what? I'm as powerful as the Byzantines or the Romans. And by this point, the Byzantines, right, have collapsed under the Ottoman rule. So it's easy for him to declare Moscow as the third Rome. Like he's the next, he's the heritage of this time of this culture of the Byzantines. And so he establishes then the autocratic rule in Russia. So Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth. So terrible could mean a couple things here, right? That he inspired terror and awe, kind of old-fashioned terrible, or he's also just becomes a terrible person. So in the beginning, he was peaceful, progressive, right, focused on these typical things that good leaders are focused on. But later he becomes crazy and paranoid. His wife died. Some people believe he had a psychotic break after his wife died, and he just starts to do crazy stuff, i.e. he pushes his pregnant daughter-in-law down the stairs, or they get in a fight, and so the daughter-in-law dies with the heir to the throne. With the grandson. And then his son comes to attack his father. He's furious because his wife and baby are killed. And then Ivan kills his son. So this is a painting from 1885 of a moment in 1581 where I think Ivan regrets what he's done. He's just killed the heir to his throne. He also created something, the Oprichniki, like secret police. And I thought this was an interesting painting from 1870. So this is the Oprichniki, and they're about to execute this guy. But they made him dress up like the Tsar before they kill him because he had this aspirations. So what I think is interesting, right, we'll sort of leave the story here, but as you may know, in the 20th century, right, Russia will go through a revolution, and but things don't change, right? They change their whole style of government, but they always remain kind of in the thrall of an absolute power and always the presence of a secret police. And so, when Ivan dies, there's kind of this break, a time of troubles, until they establish Michael Romanov in 1613. So this will be discussed more next year. But at this moment, the Romanov dynasty is established, so he sort of reasserts autocratic control, and it will last until, for 300 years, until the 20th century. Oh, poor last of the Romanovs. I don't want to spoil it, but it ends badly. So, hopefully you enjoyed this quick review of early Russia.